Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts, Ariana and Seth.
This is Seth.
This is Ariana.
And this is the Pop Cult Podcast. On January 15th, 2025, filmmaker David Lynch passed away at the age of 78. He left behind a body of work that has been more influential on me and my tastes in film than any other artist, living or dead. That doesn't mean I've adored everything David Lynch has made. I would say there's two influential Lynch works for me. The first being Twin Peaks, which I watched as it aired, partially. I was only 8 or 9 years old, and it was the episode where the killer is revealed and commits his next murder. My parents turned the channel because that was where it got a little too intense. I do remember watching the last few episodes of it, so I think we tuned back in, and it wasn't until I was in college that I was able to watch the whole thing in its entirety, I realized. And then the other piece of Lynch media that has influenced me the most was a book that I bought when I was in college called Lynch on Lynch. And it was a series that would do interviews with directors, and each chapter would cover one of their films. So like there was a Burton on Burton, there's a Scorsese on Scorsese, and so on. And so that book was really influential to me because they asked him a lot of questions about his process and his thinking. And it's something that you don't necessarily get from David Lynch in most interviews. And it helped me kind of understand how to view his work. Ultimately, we cannot explain what Lynch's work is through words, because cinema is not a language of words, but images. And so at the end of the day, as much as we're going to talk about David Lynch's movies, you have to experience the work and reflect on how it makes you feel. And then you'll understand what he was doing. So, Ariana, I introduced you to David Lynch, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. And of his films, you have seen Eraserhead, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Elephant Man.
Yes.
Dune, Blue Velvet, which we'll be talking about later in this episode. You've seen Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
I think we started watching Lost Highway and you fell asleep during it.
Well, I mean, we've seen Lost Highway, though.
Not the whole way through. I don't remember watching the whole thing with you.
No.
Did we?
Yes.
I
I think you ended up making me watch the rest of it.
No, I don't remember that.
I do.
I think you're making it up. The Straight Story, his only G-rated film, or PG, I think, and Mulholland Drive, as well as Twin Peaks: The Return. So, as someone who was introduced to Twin Peaks well into your adult years, what do you think about the filmmaker?
I think he's something that I'm going to be interested to see if we're going to have the same type of artistry up front within American cinema in the future, but it's very doubtful.
Well, there's an earnestness.
There's an earnestness, but this is also this thing of it just being here is a director who is basically going against the grain, but somehow is still popular enough that his name isn't uncommon.
The question is, how do you become that popular by making such weird art that's...
Exactly.
He didn't, other than Dune, and you could say a little bit on The Elephant Man, but mostly Dune. That's the only time he really compromised, and that is what drove him to make Blue Velvet, and then from there, he never made a movie he didn't want to make ever again.
Yeah, and the thing is, we don't really have...
I also forgot Wild at Heart you also have seen.
I've seen Wild at Heart. I think the only film I have not seen of his is...
You haven't seen Inland Empire?
No.
And I still don't think you've seen all of Lost Highway.
Yes, I have.
I will fist fight you on that after the recording. Do you have a favorite David Lynch work from what you've seen?
I think from the recent watching, I really did like Blue Velvet more than I thought I was going to. It's this interesting thing where even though I appreciate and like Twin Peaks, somehow it's slipping into the third category of my favorites of his.
Well, Twin Peaks is a good entryway into Lynch.
Yes.
To me, I think Twin Peaks: The Return is better than the original Twin Peaks. And I think Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me is better than the original Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll still always love the original 2 seasons of Twin Peaks. But there's a big chunk of it that isn't David Lynch, where he was off making Wild at Heart in the second season, and so when you start getting into the stuff where he doesn't have a hand in it, it suffers as a result.
Yeah, and it's this thing of it being like he is such a filmmaker that it's just like I've done what I've already done. I want to go do something else completely different. And especially like when you think about like the way he has his like the actors perform, there is a shift over the years where
Yeah,
he wants a falseness to be portrayed.
it's like an old. It makes me think of Douglas Sirk movies,
Yes.
like Imitation of Life or something.
Yeah.
There's that melodramatic type of acting.
Yes, where you find it being in contrast to his earlier work. And it's not to say that it's like he couldn't do it. It's not as if he got lazy or anything. It was just almost as if he was like, I already did the other stuff. I want to do it this way. I want to see what it looks like. And once it's done, it's done. And you can interpret it the way you want to, but this is the new medium that I'm going to use film with.
When I think as the further we get along, the more he was using his the paintings and sculptures and things he would do and integrating that into the film. You see it at the beginning, and then I feel like it kind of drifts away because, like Blue Velvet, I didn't necessarily see a lot of images that reminded me of his paintings. But by the time you're getting into things like Inland Empire or Twin Peaks: The Return, I'm starting to see those like things that remind me of like Eraserhead when he was really like the line between his paintings and his film work was like there's no distinguishing them.
Yes.
So without further ado, let's talk about David Lynch's first feature film, Eraserhead. Henry, played by Jack Nance, resides alone in a bleak apartment surrounded by industrial gloom. When he discovers that an earlier fling with Mary X left her pregnant, he marries the expectant mother and has her move in with him. Things take a decidedly strange turn when the couple's baby turns out to be a bizarre, lizard-like creature that won't stop wailing. Other characters, including a disfigured lady who lives inside a radiator, inhabit the building and add to Henry's troubles. I think it's funny that when you Google Eraserhead, one of the first things you see from Reddit is Eraserhead. What the fuck did I just watch? So, Ariana, this was your very first experience with Eraserhead.
Yeah.
I've seen it twice, including this time, so I'd only ever seen it one time before. Uh, what did you think about this film?
I think it is one of his most personal films. Uh, I do think there's a touch of personality of him within Blue Velvet, but this one is a total like encapsulation of sorts.
Like Henry's physical look is
Yeah,
David
it's
Lynch, yeah.
very much Lynch during that time,
Or it's like a cartoon of Lynch
or
kind
it's
of a
like the
look.
version that he wanted to be but knew it would be too strange
Yeah.
to portray. Um, it's also like the meekness that this character like goes along with because the moment that, for example, I was introduced to David Lynch is he's already fully formed as a human being, right? He's already experienced other filmmakers thinking he'd be great for other projects and him realizing I don't want to do what everyone else wants to do. I want to do my own thing. So it's a peek into like this nervous, artsy person who is basically about to just go on with his life, or maybe the idea of what if I didn't get to art and what if I was just forced to just work?
Yeah.
Which could have been the thing that, like, that's how his life was at the very beginning, right? He's going to art school. He is dedicating himself to making this film within the span of 5 years, which is dedication. And it's also like that is friendships that you are creating by having those main actors remain for those 5 years in that dedication. Um, it is the mourning of sorts of no longer being able to live within your head while being a person that will always do that and being confronted with adulthood. And the funny thing is, it's not as if anyone around him is even a good adult or a good example or explaining to him what he should be doing while he desperately wants to escape.
Yeah. Some background on the film is it's thought to have been inspired by his fear of fatherhood, and his daughter Jennifer Lynch was born with severely clubbed feet, which required lots of surgery. She said her own unexpected conception and birth defects were the basis for the film's themes, and that's what she says. He's never confirmed any of that.
Yeah.
The film's tone was shaped by Lynch's time living in a troubled neighborhood in Philadelphia. And I remember reading about this in Lynch on Lynch, where he would talk about, and I think this was, he went to art college. So I think they were in Philadelphia for a while, or he came back, and he would talk about living across the street from a morgue, and they would wash out the body bags and then hang them to dry across the street. And he said it reminded him of this like dark smile. Uh, he said that they lived in an atmosphere of violence, hate, and filth. The area was described as a crime-ridden poverty zone, which inspired the whole backdrop of Eraserhead. And then I loved this anecdote. Describing this period of his life, Lynch said, I saw so many things in Philadelphia I couldn't believe. I saw a grown woman grab her breasts and speak like a baby, complaining her nipples hurt. This kind of thing will set you back. So it was, my interpretation of it is a fear of the world seen through the eyes of a very sensitive autistic person.
Yeah.
Because he clearly, if you look at David Lynch in interviews, and especially earlier on before he became a little more media savvy and knew how to do an interview, there is an awkwardness. And then the way he directs Jack Nance in this movie, he directs him to behave like I've seen autistic people behave. The way he walks, there's this
Yeah.
sort of, he hurries, he's nervous all the time, he doesn't know how to interact in social situations. And because the film is from Henry's perspective, every social interaction feels like a nightmare.
Yeah.
So we'll talk through kind of scenes here. The first scene of the movie, the big one, is the dinner scene.
Yeah.
What did you think of that sequence where he meets Mary's parents? And one thing I really want to hone in on is this film has really been praised for its sound design and some of the sound aspects of that scene. I'm not sure if you remember all of them.
I mean, the dinner, it is, again, it is this thing that, like, we are pushing this character into adulthood when no one around them is a practical adult.
Everyone
It's,
seems unwell.
yeah, it is this thing that, like, his ex or his girlfriend, like Mary, is already crying. She's weeping. She doesn't want to have this conversation with him. The mother is the one who's like, we need to talk. While then engaging in, I guess you could call it sexual harassment against him.
But
Like,
and I kind of saw that as like this autistic person whose perspective is like a little warped or different, misinterpreting like someone's behavior, like not
yeah.
understanding what they're doing.
And then it's like where it's supposed to be, well, you made a mistake, now you're gonna go fix it. Meaning like her giving birth to this child.
Hmm.
All while it's also a shock to him, right? There's a possibility she carried this child for 9 months. So does that mean he has not seen her for 9 months or more or less, or until like the baby started to like develop, like when she was pregnant, like she noticed, oh, he's gonna notice and stopped seeing him. And there's also the implication, not really that you start thinking like you start wondering like is that his child or not? Um
Yeah, or he's just someone that she feels like won't reject her.
yeah, so it is also this thing of her not understanding like the impact of what she's done, especially because at the beginning it's like and being like the child has already been born.
But it's still at the, or as she says, you know, the baby's at the hospital, or as Mary says, they're not even sure if it is a baby,
Yeah.
which is a very creepy line before you've seen the kid.
Yes, and how it's supposed to be, well, you both are going to go get married and you're gonna live together, and that's that.
Even though when like we see his apartment, well, I mean, the whole film feels like you're inside someone's nightmare from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's not a place where you could like the kid they rested on top of a dresser drawer,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's just such a dingy, awful place. Like the production design in this movie was exceptionally good.
I mean, it does like portray that feeling of especially when you're someone who might have like lived in a nicer place while growing up. And that's the implication that we think with Lynch. Um, Growing up now suddenly in this grotesque place that does not care for the inhabitants, right? It's not as if there's a hand reaching out, hoping that everybody sleeps well and eats well during the night. There's no banging on the walls because the baby's wailing. It's as if people have tuned it out and made it part of like their day-to-day life.
So just an interesting bit of background on the movie to get it made. So Jack Fisk, who plays the man in the planet,
Yeah.
that was Sissy Spacek's husband at the time,
Okay.
and they helped fund the movie. And then Jack Nance at the time, and I don't believe they stayed married, was married to Catherine Coulson, who you might know better as the Log Lady.
Okay.
And so she worked as a waitress and donated her income to help Lynch make the movie. And then Lynch delivered newspapers additionally to keep making a movie. And I think this was made over a series of years. He would kind of get funding, film until it ran out, then take a break to do more work to make money to keep filming.
Yeah.
Uh, that dinner sequence is, I think, an interesting place to begin the movie. But before that, we do there. I saw it described as a scene of conception at the beginning, but it's a very abstracted, surreal kind of images that do look like sperm or things like that. But
Yeah.
it's not until you get to the end that you kind of realize like, oh, that's what that was. And then we have Henry walking to Mary's house, and then he gets there. And so there's an element in that scene that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, and I really noticed it this time: the nursing dog and the sound of the puppies
Oh
that
yeah.
just dominate the beginning of that scene. It's Henry and Mary, and then Mrs. X, Mary's mom, are sitting in the living room talking, and it's just deafening to me. And this is before he knows that he's the father of a baby or anything.
Yeah.
What do you think about that choice of like sound design? Because there's certain sounds in this movie that just kind of like drown out things. They make it hard to kind of hear other things.
I think it's like an implication of like what's to come, right? It's this weird thing of just being like, it's also the implication of the parents of this young woman who not only maybe never gave her the talk, they own this dog that they have not bothered to spay or neuter.
Hmm.
And now the puppies are there and they're probably going to complain about like the mess, but they're just going to live with it
It
because,
interferes in their life.
yes.
Yeah. And that's what the baby does for Henry, right?
Yeah.
Uh, the the dinner scene has some very interesting visual elements. I feel like Mr. X, Mary's dad, that actor, Alan Joseph, the way he plays it is so interesting, and it didn't feel like many Lynch characters ever seen before. There was sort of there was an energy, like a friendliness with Henry.
I mean that you can connect it to like how Jack Nance later on plays his character in Twin Peaks, like this friendly old
Yeah.
man who like can't stop talking and like can't stop talking despite the fact that you're surrounded by something that doesn't feel all that good.
Well, they're preparing some kind of small fowl for dinner, and then he
Yeah.
wants Henry to serve it,
Yeah, to carve it.
carve it, and the thing starts squirting blood out of its cavity. And then the mother, Mrs. X, sort of goes into this weird, uh, kind of pseudo-sexual trance.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm like, anybody that's like trying to make sense of like, oh, what does that mean? I just kept going back to this is the perspective of someone who has very socially awkward autism. That's what it feels like to them, where people make like a face and you're like, what did that mean? Or people's behavior just doesn't make sense to what you know. And so there isn't any greater meaning in it beyond you're getting to experience how the world is seen through the eyes of this person.
Yeah.
And so eventually, we have Mary and Henry, and they are together now, married, living with the girlfriend. We now have the baby. What did you think of those scenes between these two people and this puppet in his apartment, and like the atmosphere and the tone of those scenes?
There is this interesting tone, especially because at the beginning we see Mary alone with the baby. Um, she's uncomfortable at times, and then when like Henry comes in, she's kind of pretending that everything's great. Up until the point that it's just sort of like she can't sleep and she complains about how the baby won't stop crying. And it's not as if like in the film she goes and turns around and goes like, "You try it." It is this
She
like,
just goes back to her parents' home to sleep for the night and then
yeah,
never comes back.
but it's also this idea of it just being like she's already been conditioned with the idea that she should be the sole take care, like carer for the child, and that she should know how to soothe the child. And but like before she leaves, because she's like, I just need a decent night's sleep. Um, she tells Henry like in anger, like, and you better take care of it good. Everything better be good when I come back.
Well, I've also wondered about the timeline of the film, which is going to be very hard to do because it is such a surreal, abstracted thing. Is this all taking place over the course of like a couple days, or is this one day, or is this a long period of time? And I think that's almost an impossible question to answer, but maybe kind of the point that it is blurred, like how long he's in there with the baby. Um, we have these two figures looming over Henry's life, and I'm interested to talk about what we think their purpose is. One of them, I feel like I do have an understanding of what they are. The other one, I'm not so sure. The one I'd say I'm a little more confident with is the girl in the radiator. The one who I'm a bit more unsure of is the man in the planet. So let's talk
Okay.
about the girl in the radiator. Very famous scene. People that are fans of the Pixies have probably heard their cover of In Heaven,
Yeah.
which is from this movie, sung by the girl in the radiator, who is this fantasy, not necessarily sexual, I would say, but this sort of place where Henry goes to forget about the world around him. Because we see
Yeah.
him laying on his bed almost like a kid on his stomach, and he's staring into the radiator. The cries of the baby are in the background, and then we just see like this light from inside the radiator, and there's a little stage in there with a curtain. What did you think of the girl in the radiator?
I I was at like whenever I saw her, I was like, oh, this is a woman made out of dust,
Ooh,
like
talk
dust
about that. What?
bunnies.
Yeah.
Just because like the way that her cheeks almost seem like cotton.
Someone
Um,
says she looks like a anthropomorphized cloud.
yeah, and like there is kind of like this innocence versus sexualness,
Well,
right?
she's performing. She's singing and like doing this kind of sidestep shuffle.
But yeah, it's such an innocent kind of like display of a
Very Shirley
song.
Temple kind of.
Yeah, and it kind of also contradicts with the sultriness of like his neighbor
Hmm.
across the hall from him. Um it's like this innocence that he's attracted to and wishes to be absorbed by that is away from like the dinginess of the world that he lives in. She might be constructed with the dinginess, but she still has a light about her.
Yeah, I do think I think there's something to do with his creativity because this is a thing that he imagines and invents. But when you start to analyze the lyrics of the song, in heaven everything is fine. You've got your good things and I've got mine, and it's just that kind of rip. In heaven everything is fine. In heaven everything is fine. I think that she is the suicidal impulse.
Oh, okay.
I think she represents the world is very overwhelming and dark for him. And the idea that in heaven, which we only go to heaven when we die, everything is going to be okay. And if we think about the end of the film, the final shot of the film is she embraces him in this just room full of bright, blinding white light.
Yeah.
And after what he's done, I think because the whole thing that you were talking about, Henry's inaction is a big part of the movie. Henry
Yeah.
really doesn't do anything until the last like 10 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
And what he does is like the worst thing he could do. And I'm wondering if we're supposed to interpret that then Henry kills himself after that.
Yeah.
And that's the embrace of the girl in the radiator because now he is in heaven. Uh, Then we have the man and the planet. So it's this figure inside this large kind of paper mache planet thing that they've made, and he's operating levers. The near the end of the movie, we have the head of the baby, and it kind of shifts back and forth between this giant baby head and the planet.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, visually, I feel like there's a connection being made between these two objects.
Hmm.
And inside the planet, we have this man pulling these levers. What do you think? I think I have an idea a little bit. I think maybe this is a sort of rough interpretation of a godlike figure,
Yeah.
but the connection with the baby.
Well, I think it's I don't I couldn't really say like the interpretation fully as to, and again, like Lynch loved the idea of just you interpret it what it is. That's exactly what it is. Um,
Well, like for example, he said one of the things that helped him figure out how to make the movie was he was looking through the Bible and found a verse, and he said, "Oh yeah, when I found that verse, it immediately clicked with me." And so in interviews, he'd be asked, "Oh, which verse was it?" I do not remember. He just doesn't remember what he said, but I just remember reading it, and it was like, yes, that made sense.
um,
And he says this is his most spiritual work.
yeah. And I think it's also just having to do with the fact that like I think about like Catholicism of like um how a child who's like unborn will just end up going back to heaven and becoming a what like an angel or some shit. Um, but it's I don't know exactly. So what was your interpretation to
I
see?
do think because of that, he says it's his most spiritual film. That's where I'm starting to think the man on the planet is God. And so what he imagines is a child's version of God, right? A man up in the sky who pulls levers and then things happen to us down here.
Yeah.
Uh, and because we see those levers being pulled and the planet explodes at the end of the movie after Henry does what he does, makes me think that the film is about him feeling as though God is going to judge him for what he did. And so then he does kill himself so he can go to heaven
Yeah.
where everything is fine.
Okay.
The imagery in the film, uh, sperm imagery in this movie, there's a lot of it.
Yeah, there is like at the
The,
very beginning and then
then when
like
the girl in the radiator is dancing, I thought those were sperm, but I saw someone say they look like a urethra and testicles.
okay.
Like if you ever see like anatomy drawings
Yeah.
of the actual organs, and she's avoiding them at first, which is interesting. Like they're dropping from the ceiling and she's shuffling, but then eventually there's so many of them on the floor, it's almost like she doesn't want to, but she gives in to this impulse and just starts crushing them,
Yeah.
and then they explode. And then later we have the scene where Henry is in bed with his neighbor, which I am very much convinced is a fantasy. It's a dream. It's not real. That
Yeah.
never happens. And the bed turns into this like pool with a tarp that has this very milky liquid in it.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to I think Lynch is very sensitive to sensory input. We know that with the sound. I
Yes.
also think sex and the textures, the sensory texture that comes with it, for someone who is that sensitive, it can be a strange thing
Yeah, I mean, I've heard about a lot of neurodivergent people who don't enjoy the act of sex.
because of the feel of it.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
don't like like there's nothing in there that they're just like part of them like they understand the impulse for it, but they just don't understand like there's this overwhelmingness of being touched
The sensory experience
and the
overwhelms them.
sensory experience and then like the fact that then there's like the expelling of liquids, of like the mouth, spit, it becomes too much because it's like,
If you're an agoraphobe, if you're like a germaphobe, sex can be a very difficult thing, I would think.
or it's just also just like not being able to control it.
Yeah.
And beyond just the idea of just being like, okay, he's a neurodivergent person, I think it's just like when you even think about it, just being highly anxious or just highly sensitive to these things, or the sexuality being just like this white milky pool. And then it's also just that interesting part that later comes in the movie that when um he sees the neighbor sees him, and then suddenly she's staring at him and he has
The baby's
the
head.
baby's head. Like I don't know if it's supposed to be like his interpretation of what she sees in him, or it just being her being like,
He
yeah, I might be a sexual desire to you, but I can't look at you that way because I hear your baby cry every day.
Or it could also be she sees him in the same way he sees his child, this grotesque alien thing
Yeah.
that she doesn't want to have anything to do with. Um, the the dream sequence that gives us the title of the movie, that's a part I've never really understood. I do want to say I enjoy that scene, especially when the boss comes out uh, and that actor, the way he sings it, Paul. And then when Paul follows them into the room to make the pencils, and he goes, "Desk, Paul." And it was just the way that guy talked. It felt like there are aspects of this movie that feel like old classic Hollywood,
Yeah.
which is weird to say about a movie that's as like bizarre as this one. But it is like that actor feels like someone you might see in like a Laurel and Hardy short or something.
Yeah.
This big blustery kind of boss figure. We have this child who brings the head that explodes off of Henry in his dream to, and the child like knows where to take it. He takes it to a pencil factory, and when the boss sees it, he knows what to do with it. And they put it in this machine. They extract a core from the head and put that inside the machine, and it starts popping erasers onto pencils. What do you think that was about? Because I still am like, I don't quite know what that I'm supposed to take from that. Like, why Eraserhead?
I'm still kind of pondering that because it's also like you get such bizarre scenes followed by beautifully versions where it's this funny thing is like I think it's like either scraps of
It's eraser dust,
it's eraser dust and they push it away and it flutters into light
and it becomes stars.
and it becomes stars and then
Or
you see his head.
Wait, and then there's the scene. It's basically like if you ever see the poster for Eraserhead, that's what it is. And that is like a gorgeous scene, the way it's lit, and you have those little flecks of erasers floating down behind him, and he's kind of staring off, and he feels like he's just kind of lost in a void.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I feel like that's the feeling I got from this movie this time around was just the feeling of being so lost in such a confusing, violent world.
Yeah, it was that. It is an incredible, to me, is an incredibly sad film.
Mhm.
Without it really telling you to your face, why is it that Henry is sad? He lives in a place that is like depressing, it's dark, it feels cold, either like
It's never
physically but also emotionally.
There's no sunlight. It feels like
There's no sunlight. There is no like good communication between people.
the one window in his apartment. I love that shot early on where it cuts to it and you just see a brick wall like right up against the glass. So there's like not even a chance he's gonna get like a glimmer of a view.
Yeah, and so it's not as if we even get a hint of the relationship between him and Mary from the beginning when it was like flirtatious or happy. We're going right into the misery of it. And it's also one of those films that like as you know more about it, you kind of also feel sad for the people who maybe inspired it.
Yeah.
And that relates back to another podcast that will only be a patron exclusive. We talk about intimacies.
Oh well, no, that's yeah. On our Patreon, we'll be starting soon a spotlight series on the Japanese director Ryosuke Hamaguchi. But that first episode, Intimacies, will be free on the feed.
And in it, we
Yeah.
talk about like what is vulnerability versus exploitation.
Yeah, and like, yeah, how do you know the line between when you're being inspired or when you're just stealing someone's story from them?
Yeah,
And I think in this instance, he is being inspired, but it would be easy to misinterpret him saying it was bad to have a child when it's more about I was terrified to transition from the innocence that I knew to this more difficult adulthood.
yeah, but it's also when you think about like it is, and it's a beautiful thing when you have a group of friends that are willing to sacrifice their wages for you to fulfill the dream of making this film. And the question is like, there's probably a ton of arguments between him and his then like spouse during that time.
Who I think was in the movie to some capacity, Peggy Lynch. Yeah.
To then be like, well, that's great if we want to buy a new crib for the baby, but I'm gonna maybe use it for the film.
Yeah.
So it is this thing of it just being like it makes you sad, but this is also part of like capitalism, which does not allow you to
You can't
go into your
yeah, you
art.
can't pursue your art and take care of your family
Yeah.
unless you're a nepo baby born into a rich family.
Yeah, and it's one that's like it's a film that I both cherish but also have like there's a sadness.
Oh yeah. Would you recommend our audience watch Eraserhead? And if you do, maybe any sort of caveats you have there.
I think just go in knowing that the grotesque with David Lynch never really lasts that long.
And he's just as disgusted by it as you are. Yeah.
Yes.
And that it's the purpose of, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in Blue Velvet, the purpose of the upsetting things is to highlight the beauty of the good things.
Yeah.
Well, when we come back, we will be talking about the film that some might argue made David Lynch, and that is Blue Velvet. College student Jeffrey Beaumont, played by Kyle MacLachlan, returns home after his father has a stroke. When he discovers a severed ear in an abandoned field, Beaumont teams up with the detective's daughter, Sandy Williams, Laura Dern, to solve the mystery. They believe beautiful lounge singer Dorothy Valens, Isabella Rossellini, may be connected with the case, and Beaumont finds himself becoming drawn into her dark, twisted world, where he encounters sexually depraved psychopath Frank Booth, played by Dennis Hopper. This is Blue Velvet, released in 1986. I would say, after having rewatched this movie last night, I think it is my favorite David Lynch movie ever.
Yeah.
I think this is his most beautiful looking movie. Not that his other movies are ugly, but this one just, it felt. One thing I did while we were watching the movie was I looked up the lens that was used on the film because I was like, wow, there's just something so crisp and like even though it's a low budget movie, it looked like a really like high end movie.
Yeah.
And so I found it was the same lens that was used in things like Return of the Jedi, and films like that. And I think it was the same lens he used in Dune. But here, and also it probably helped that the film has been remastered too. This world feels so vivid and real.
Yes.
Like it feels like there's so many parts of this world we don't get to see, but even though we're not seeing them, there's still things happening. And we can easily see how this would lead to his inspiration for Twin Peaks. Um, so we're kind of going to go through the movie, through some of the major sequences, and talk about the actors as we go. Um, the opening scene of this movie, uh, lovely music playing. We see firefighters on a fire truck driving by, roses growing in front of a picket fence, a man watering his lawn, and then he collapses having a stroke. And then the camera just dives deep into the grass and it keeps going and the music becomes more ominous. And then it's just this swarm of insects just crawling over each other. And I think it's, having watched the movie multiple times, that is the thesis of the movie.
Yeah.
And so tell me what you thought of that scene and how you think it relates to the overall film.
I think the way that it relates to overall the film is kind of the sensation that it gives me when I think about the world that Stephen King's It belongs
Hmm.
to, right? On the surface, everything seems fine, but oh shit, all the adults are in on this.
Or they're trying to pretend like it's not there.
Yes.
Yeah.
They know about this evil, but they have not told us about it, and they get what's worse is they haven't protected us from it either.
Yeah, by not preparing you for it, you don't know how to deal with it when you have to confront it.
And that, of course, kind of relates the relationship between Jeffrey and Sandy. They are on like the edge of adulthood, but still they're young. So in a sense, they can be forgiven as to not knowing or not participating, while also being told, don't participate, and we're warning you, this isn't good.
Yeah, because we have Sandy's father, the police detective, is telling he can't tell Jeffrey what's going on, and he doesn't want Jeffrey to talk to anybody about it. But trust me, one day I'll tell you. And how many times have you had an adult tell you that,
Yes.
right? And you're like, but I think I can. I want to know. I feel the pull to know right now. Uh, what did you think of baby Kyle MacLachlan's performance here? He's met Lynch on the set of Dune. I don't think Dune is a great showcase for MacLachlan. He's fine in that movie. He does the best he can with what he's given.
Yeah.
But here is really where I think we see the Kyle MacLachlan of Twin Peaks kind of being born.
I think this is the Kyle MacLachlan that is still, this character, I think, still relates to Lynch and to some degrees, right? Not full-heartedly, not the way that Eraserhead is, but this is before kind of so, like it's a there's a tab that was pulled afterwards that he was like severed the this character is a representation of me once Twin Peaks rolls in.
Hmm.
It's this young man that has lived a pretty decent life. He's having this relationship with this young woman that could lead to romance. He's there for not great reasons. His dad has suffered a stroke and doesn't seem to be coming back to the way that he was
Well,
before.
there's that scene where he goes to see him in the hospital, and his father's just like choking,
Yeah.
trying, and then just starts crying because he can't communicate in any way with his son.
And yet, however, he's escaping adulthood to some degree by playing detective, then but also not understanding that like he's going into something that he has no understanding and no way of knowing when to stop.
Yeah, he doesn't know where the boundaries of this evil begin and end.
Yeah. So it's kind of the film goes into a darker path of what we would normally see as a comedy, right? Or
Mhm.
you think like the kid detective finally comes in and is gonna solve the
Well,
crime.
I think yeah, there's Lynch in all of his work is evoking memories he has of movies he saw when he was a kid,
Yeah.
but he can't keep them the way they were when he was a kid because he's also an aging man who is seeing more and more of the world and how kind of dismal and dark it can be.
Yeah.
And so there's this tug of war in his work
Yeah,
of the
because
beautiful, the sublime, and the despair.
and it's this thing of thinking that like since the world has rules, the world that we live in, the supposed good world has rules, then there has to be rules in the underbelly. Only to figure out there are no rules. And even if you plead for the good guys to come save you, they're not good anymore because of the like the thing that the rules don't exist within that dark edge.
What did you think of Kyle MacLachlan as a leading man in this role? He feels very classic.
Yes, he's also just it's he has like that perfect mix of like innocence while also just I don't know how to describe it of just giving into his impulses.
Well, because I mean, he has like a pretty graphic sex scene in the movie,
Yes.
and when he does, and like the way Lynch shoots it and the way he distorts the audio, it becomes very animalistic.
Yes. And those are, the animalistic stuff is rippled, especially within Twin Peaks Returns.
When we think about Bob,
Or we think about like, Laura's mom watching the TV, like
yeah, in the
all like
return, yeah,
um,
this reminder that yeah, we're people, but we are also animals who, if things just go a certain way, you just kind of devolve.
yes. And it's also his acting is so subtle and it's so different from in the future what future lies ahead of him
It
working with Lynch.
it's a very different performance than Cooper.
Yes,
Cooper
this
is almost like a comic book superhero to a certain degree.
yeah, like Cooper along with the rest of the Twin Peaks is like soap opera, comic booky. very much like good guy who's ready to fight bad. This is more like an innocent, realistic kind of portrayal, which really surprised me, especially with like Laura Dern.
We'll get to Laura Dern.
Yeah.
Kyle MacLachlan, there's a great scene in this movie that I feel is the core, emotional core of the movie. And it's Jeffrey, he's just sitting and he's contemplating sort of what is going on. And he thinks about Dorothy and he thinks about her child and he just starts weeping and he's alone. And I think to me that is Lynch. He he doesn't want to lose the innocent beauty that he sees in the world, but he is wrestling and coming to terms with the ugliness that is evident in it.
Yeah.
And so I found that to just be such like a sweet scene. And it's a scene we don't get in movies. You think now we have these movies. I always think back to like that Nobody movie with Bob Odenkirk and what a vile film I feel that is.
Yeah.
Because it is so, there's no humanity in it. And this is a movie that goes to very dark places, but Lynch refuses to like revel in that evil. He wants his characters to hurt. They hurt like Jeffrey really hurts from going through this, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it's important to have scenes where, your leading man cries because not because of what's happened to him, but the empathy he has for someone else
Yes.
and how he sees it being so unfair that she's treated in this way. And I think that's such a beautiful moment in the movie. We'll talk about Laura Dern. I think she's only 17 years old when she made this movie. Her first work with David Lynch,
Yeah.
who she would go on Wild at Heart, of course, and then Twin Peaks: The Return. And I know they had always talked about other chances to work. Oh, and then Inland Empire. She's
Yeah.
also in that. Um, what do you think of very young Laura Dern's performance in this movie?
She's great. It's interesting because we've seen her, like I saw her in similar ages. There was like another movie where she's playing like the Southern Belle. I forgot what it was.
Ramblin' Rose,
Yes.
which I think, yeah, was a few years after, like
Um,
89 or something.
but this one, she's just so natural and feels very comfortable in the scenes. Um,
Like
there's
she really makes acting look easy.
yes.
And you do think, oh, that she is this character
And the
completely.
same like when these characters like are together, like Sandy and Jeffrey, you can understand the chemistry completely. You can understand why it is that they like each other.
The chicken dance.
The chicken dance is very charming.
And it feels like a very just like kind of in the moment kind of scene.
Yeah.
Because her response is, oh, I forget exactly what she says, where she's like, wow, well, that's something. Like it's just sort of not really knowing how to react to it. Uh,
Or she wants to laugh, but she also knows like she needs to remain a certain like dignity.
you're in the scene. You're in the scene. And I love the stories that she tells about whenever Lynch was trying to cast, and he'd already knew Kyle MacLachlan was going to play the lead, and how he brought her to Bob's Big Boy
Uh-huh.
to sit there and talk with Kyle as like a chemistry test. And she was like, we just all got along perfectly.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those where like you can feel it when you watch the movie. Like
Yes.
these two actors and the person making the movie love each other and they love making this movie
Yeah,
together.
and there's a respect. It's one where the character of Sandy could easily been discarded by half of the film. Because she is the person who is giving Jeffrey information as to where to go to. Um, she's also there to like delay anything from happening to him. Being the fact that she has information for being like the detective's daughter.
As a plot device.
Yeah,
But she's much more than that.
and it's this interesting thing that because we don't go that way, then we have to see the results of what it is that he's done that she is not completely like privy to, right? She knows the details a little bit, but not enough
She's
to,
still a high school student.
yeah, she's a high school student. She doesn't really know that that Jeffrey and like Dorothy are having sex. She just knows they have a relationship, and it's this interesting thing where there's no display of like jealousy. Like in fact, she's kind of dating someone in high school.
Yeah.
And she's feeling horrible about it, which I kind of enjoyed. I like the fact that they didn't make it like it's a thing, but
It doesn't take over the movie.
yeah, it doesn't take her, and she's not overly and like upset about it. She just knows she could have handled it better.
Uh, I love her introduction into the movie. I don't know if you remember how she's introduced. She emerges from the darkness,
Yeah.
which to me is how creativity works, right?
Yeah.
It's a void, and then it's the way Lynch would probably describe it, is there's nothing, and then out of nothing, something emerges. And then you have to go, what is this? And you start like studying it and figuring it out. And so it's Jeffrey has kind of reached a dead end with trying to figure out what's going on with this ear he finds. And then out of dreams emerges Sandy.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I think there's a scene we have later where Jeffrey emerges from the darkness, where it's a shot of like the sidewalk, and then suddenly Jeffrey appears. But I loved Dern's Robin's monologue, which I think is that crying scene for Jeffrey is this is what that scene is for Sandy,
Yeah.
where it's sort of you understand how they're seeing the world and this dream she has about a world without any love in it, and it was this dark world. When I immediately thought of Eraserhead,
Yeah.
but then, and it was because all the robins had gone away, and I know she even goes, and robins are a metaphor for love. So it's almost like somebody describing a Lynch movie.
Yeah.
And then how it's about when the robins return, love will return, sort of thing. Uh, and she just delivers that monologue so wonderfully, and it feels so authentic. And the way like Kyle MacLachlan just sits there and kind of takes it in and reacts to her.
Yeah.
Like he really is. That's the scene where he like falls in love with Sandy.
Yeah, because Sandy's like is on the verge of tears as she's like talking basically about a dream that she had, which dreams are such an important factor into
Well,
David Lynch's
we'll
work.
we'll talk more about dreams here in a little bit. You're jumping ahead of me, Mom. So yeah, we've got these two great leads, and then we introduce he does a very good job of like slowly introducing each of the four central characters.
Yeah.
So then we're introduced to Dorothy Valens, who is the shadow version of Sandy.
Yeah.
She's older, she's more world-wise, and as a result, worn down by the world. She's a singer at a bar, and she is in a very horrible situation. She's played by Isabella Rossellini, who I think was dating Lynch at the time or would date him very soon after. What did you think of Rossellini's performance as Dorothy Valens?
It's a good performance. It's also I wouldn't say it's exclusively hard to watch. She is that character that I can understand about being like, oh, the misogyny of this film. Um, I think what it is a lot of times with Lynch is it's almost like when he says, if I'm going to touch the dark underbelly, we have to understand that it is women who get hurt, and that for me to feel that pain, unfortunately, I have to see how the woman has suffered.
And I think, yeah, when you watch a Lynch movie and you see the suffering of women, and if it feels very strong and powerful, it's because he's very sensitive to that.
Yeah, like there is the it's almost as if like it's a contrast with Eraserhead for me. Because in Eraserhead, it's very much about this man living in his head, and there isn't a lot of sympathy for the mother who, like, she leaves the child with. There is no interesting conversation between him and the sexy neighbor across the hall.
Yeah, but I mean, an Eraserhead, no character is really a character.
Yeah,
When you
no
think like,
character, and unless you're stuck within the perspective of Henry.
yeah,
But in this one, it is the complexity of these women who live within Jeffrey's world.
his mom and his aunt, or yeah,
And the fact that like he is so set on figuring out, was this a murder with the ear? Who did the ear belong to? And it's this interesting thing that like we don't really get to say if he's right or wrong. We just know there has been a wrong that has occurred,
Mhm.
and there is something horrible happening, and that it shouldn't be happening because we are sitting in the darkness watching this woman doused in blue who's singing in anguish, who is suffering, but we're going to ignore her suffering. Like part of it is almost like we are an audience, not only to the fact that we're watching her sing, but it's also that pain that she's carrying because of where she's at in this life.
Well,
And
and I think the scenes where she asked Jeffrey to physically hurt her,
yeah,
and you see him freeze and become very conflicted, and like when he does it, there's guilt afterwards.
yeah,
But I do think there's some people who interpret this as like, oh, it's, Lynch who has this, negative opinion of, the woman as a slut or whatever. But I don't think that's what it is. I think what it is you're seeing Jeffrey forming this understanding of people who are degraded and dehumanized will sometimes adapt their psychology to just make that a part of how they receive affection because
yeah.
they're not receiving affection in any other way.
Well, it's also the fact that she's having sex with someone who isn't her husband,
Yeah.
who she's declaring that she does love her husband. She's like, I want to know where Dawn is. It's not okay. And so for her to have sex with these men that aren't her husband, then it needs to come with pain. And like he is just as guilty to some degree with like Frank, even though he's like, no, I want to help you, but you're still engaging in sex with someone who is not fully there
She's, yeah, clearly
because of her
mentally ill.
pain.
Yeah.
And it's the lure that you're thinking, well, if I give her the sex of a man who cares and wants to see her better, that's better. But it isn't
Mhm.
because it's still sex. And it's still something that maybe she gets some relief from, but she's still thinking of her husband.
Yeah. Uh, the the closet scene is like a very iconic, probably if you made a list of like all-time great film scenes,
Yeah.
Jeffrey in the closet would be up there.
Yeah.
Everything about it, like the production design of the apartment, the camera angles, it's just all so perfectly put together. Um, what do you think, if anything, is being said about voyeurism in this movie? Because Jeffrey does look at a lot of things. He looks into a world that he doesn't belong to a lot.
Yeah.
And at one point, Sandy asks him, well, you can't go to my dad. You've even said that because you've gotten all this information illegally. What do you plan on doing with all this evidence? And Jeffrey doesn't really have a good answer for her.
Yeah.
So do you think this part of this is about Jeffrey getting off on the idea of being an interloper in this world?
Yeah, I do think so. I do think that it's also he comes in thinking that he's this white knight in shining armor that like because he's better than the rest of these men, because he's not like a criminal or evil, that he can somehow outwit them. But then there's displays that it's he is like over his head.
Because you can't outwit people who are behaving like savage animals. Like,
Yeah, and you can't outwit someone who's willing to like beat you to a bloody pulp. Like it's
yeah,
especially if he has like gang members with him. It's this thing of it just being like again, he comes from a world where the rules matter, and then you cross over to the world that the rules don't fucking matter because they're willing to break them.
yeah. They see your rules as a joke.
Yeah.
This sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Uh, so the fourth performance I want to talk about here is Dennis Hopper as Frank Booth, who isn't in a lot of the movie, but what he parts he is in, I think it is an unforgettable performance. I know he's been on like lists of like greatest film villains of all time.
Yeah.
What did you think of Frank?
It is delivered so intensely, and it makes such a great contrast between Kyle MacLachlan and like Laura Dern's performances, which are very realistic, to going to like this hyper
Manic.
manic nightmarish version of someone who you're just like, oh, you're insane.
Uh, and I like that you brought up that thing because I think we do have a duality here. We have Jeffrey Sandy versus Dorothy Frank.
Yeah.
So it's the light and the dark. Now, I do think Lynch has a lot of empathy for Dorothy because the last scene of the movie is not Jeffrey and Sandy's happy ending. It's Dorothy in the park with her son, her husband's dead, and then Isabella Rossellini, one of the lines from Blue Velvet being sung about, always see blue velvet through my tears.
Yeah.
And I think anybody that would believe Lynch doesn't have empathy for that character, like, is missing that entire scene because the fact that he ends on it and he has that line, it's reminding us that, okay, yeah, Jeffrey and Sandy are good. What about Dorothy, though? Like, her husband's been killed. She was like raped consistently. She has her son back and she's happy about that. But there is this look of like sadness on her face
Yeah.
that like she's lost something that can't ever be given back to her.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it's a very affecting way to end the movie. Uh, the wild ride with Frank sequence,
Yeah.
especially when they get to Ben, played by Dean Stockwell. That sequence. Talk to me about what you felt about that scene and the things that went on in it and how it made you feel.
It's like Lynch has this insane yet good thing about when it feels like a nightmare, it feels like a nightmare. There is like this sense either it be like repeated images,
Unrelenting.
yes, unrelenting. Like the thing about it is knowing you keep telling yourself a lot of times when I'm watching horror or gore, it's like it's not real, it's not real. And it tends to like ease my mind a little bit. There's something about this that like because it feels so unhinged that it feels like he's pricking you with needles and
Hmm.
daring you to look away. And but the performances are so like
Well, there's an unpredictability
yes.
because when you come into Ben's little lounge and you meet him, he's such a bizarre character when you already are with some very bizarre characters. And in the beginning of Twin Peaks: The Return, when we're introduced to Evil Cooper,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and he goes to that house that's like out in the middle of nowhere, and there's those creepy people inside that he's like picking something up from. That's what this scene reminded me of,
Yeah.
where you're just like, I don't know the full details of what's happening here, but the vibe is awful and I want to leave. It would be like this has never happened to me, but from stories I've heard from people, I would imagine it like, going over to a drug dealer's house and you just want to buy weed, but things just kind of keep getting weirder, and the guy's like keeps like he's almost kind of on an ADHD spiral, and he isn't giving you the weed, and he's wanting to like show you, or like Alfred Molina in Boogie Nights.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's a very Lynchian scene to me, where you're like, the potential for violence is at maximum, but you also like it could just completely fizzle out and no one could be hurt. Like you don't know where things are gonna go.
And it works because it's like you don't know these characters fully. It like you've seen
You're in Jeffrey's shoes.
yeah, like you've seen Frank a few times, but it's been within like Dorothy's apartment. So you know the layout and you know the ins and out, and you're just like, okay, yeah, it's Frank. Frank's fucking crazy. But like once you're like getting into the car and like you're just moving about like to go to the net, you're just kind of like, I don't know where I am. And this is not good. And so you're just like, is Jeffrey gonna die? Does it turn out that it's Jeffrey's ear? Like that's it.
So dreams. We
Yeah.
brought that up a little bit before. Ben lip syncs Roy Orbison's "In Dreams" as
Yes.
a performance for Frank. And we also see Frank almost in a trance while Dorothy sings Blue Velvet. And he has this weird fetish about Blue Velvet. What do you think's going on with Frank in these songs? Because he also gets very mad. It feels like an animal that's been lulled, and then suddenly he just kind of like rages.
Yeah, then the ranges are very much like, don't look at me.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's vulnerability. The
yeah.
songs reveal his vulnerable sensitivity.
And then I think he gets angry because of it. It's like, oh, you made me feel something and it felt good, but fuck you for doing it.
Does that remind you of anything currently? I
Yeah.
mean, like a large swath of men in the United States, this idea, and that's why I said to me, it was so beautiful to see Jeffrey weep, just as he was thinking about Dorothy and what she's going through,
Yeah.
because that's juxtaposed with Frank, who the minute he starts to feel empathy or connection, hits Dorothy in the face,
Yeah. Or reminds her of what he's taken from her.
or like calls her like just the most vulgar names you could imagine. And it's a man who cannot reckon with his soul. He can't reckon with his humanity. He lives in a world where toxic masculinity and hair trigger violence is how you get through things. But he's yearning for the sensitivity because like he softens when he hears these songs,
Yeah.
but it never lasts because he's reminded of how awful the world is. And in that way, he is the shadow Jeffrey. He's the one that Jeffrey doesn't want to become. Jeffrey wants to treasure that vulnerability and understand that his vulnerability and his empathy is a strength, while where Frank sees it as a weakness.
Yeah.
Because when Jeffrey stands up for Dorothy, he does it knowing Frank is going to like brutalize him.
Yeah. Like
But it's because it's what his soul tells him to do. And Frank hates that because I think there is a part of Frank that acknowledges that boy is right.
yeah. And it's also the fact that this is not only is he right, he's the only one that's been willing to tell me that is right when he has all these lackeys around him. That could have done it at any moment.
So there's a scene in this movie that was inspired from an incident from Lynch's childhood. When he was a boy, and I think he tells this about it's in the David Lynch The Art Life documentary, I think
Yeah.
is where it was. He talks about he and his brother, I believe, playing outside, and it was kind of late at night, and then out of the shadows, their neighbor stumbles, and she was naked and bruised. And it turned out her husband was domestic abusing her, horrible guy. But as a young child, that image, she said, just like resonated with him. And what I think is that was the moment where this sort of idyll of the 1950s for David Lynch, the crack formed.
Yeah.
That these beautiful places that I live hide very dark things sometimes.
Yes.
And not knowing how do I keep going knowing this truth?
How do you reckon with that?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times I think about the one thing that I find just so abhorrently boring is that a lot of times with like female characters, um, they have to adopt the male characteristics in order to become strong, to become badass. And especially when we start talking about like the newest version of Nosferatu's, like I might not love like
Lily Rose
Rose
Depp.
Depp, but I like the fact that the character's so meek because it's like it feels like that feels a part of the time and
Well,
it feels
it feels
realistic.
like an authentic person because like most men do not match their portrayals as these brave, hyper masculine people in movies. Most men in situations like that are going to be fucking meek and scared.
Yeah. And it's also just this thing of it being like, again, I'm not saying that this is like that David Lynch was some type of like hardcore feminist,
I think he was a feminist, yeah.
but I think there is just something of like this display of it being like Dorothy at the end of the day, even though she may have brought herself to this situation, is still a person who deserves love. And that the thing is, like, Jeffrey confuses it because he wants to help her and wants for her to feel loved. And so he connects it with sex, which was like the big no no to begin with. He should have never crossed that
Yeah.
line, but he's young.
But then I go back to the way the movie ends, right? It ends on this, yeah, Jeffrey saved her kind of, but like she has to live with the trauma. And I also think of Because I know sometimes people will go like, "Oh, David Lynch just has a fetish for like tragic women," but I don't think that it's the way they think because his heroes don't save these women. Look at for spoilers for Twin Peaks: The Return. Cooper, through the power of magic, right, goes back in time and saves Laura Palmer from being murdered.
Yeah.
But that doesn't stop it. And when you think about the end of that movie, it's a horrific nightmare. So the idea is Agent Cooper didn't save anybody. He damned himself too.
No, and like in turn, it's almost as if like Laura's spirit is indicating that thanks to people's obsession, she has to relive the horrors of her life and her murder over and over again,
And so I think
and that
what
she will never find peace
and so
because
what
of
I
it.
think the tragedy that Lynch sees in these women isn't, oh, let me save them. It's oftentimes you can't save them. Like, because what's happened to them is beyond one person's actions.
Yeah.
It's something like it's systemic. That's where you talk about the darkness beneath this beautiful neighborhood is that there's this systemic evil in things.
Yeah, that even though like okay, you get to save one person who then has to go out to fix themselves,
Yeah,
right?
because Dorothy's got to keep
Because
living.
Dorothy has to continue living and let's be honest, no matter what happens in our lives, we could never go back to the person that we were because your experiences have marked you, either good or bad. You're never going to be the same person. You construct yourself as is. Um, but it's also this thing of it being like Jeffrey does have to stop to a certain degree because if he doesn't, then Sandy will be pulled in.
Yeah.
And so if he loves and cherishes Sandy as she is at that moment, he can't drag her down and then be witness to what's occurring.
Uh, I think with the dreams is that's where Lynch finds hope. He looks at the waking material world and is like, man, things are fucking scary.
Yeah.
So where can I go for hope? And when you hear him, he talks about creativity so much, that's where he finds hope. He was a big proponent of transcendental meditation as a means to access like deeper layers of creativity, to really go within yourself and find ideas that you didn't even know were there. And he was also a big believer that when we imagine we are connecting with something, he didn't know what it was, but he's like, it does feel like these they come from somewhere outside of me too.
Yeah.
And so the dreams that we have are always filtered through ourselves. And we go to Sandy's dream. And that's where Sandy finds hope in the dream that one day, the robins will return and so will love. And I think that's like a key component of understanding Lynch is he doesn't believe the darkness is forever.
Yeah.
It's very potent. It's overwhelming. It is suffocating. But there is hope in something.
Yeah.
Uh, would you recommend Blue Velvet to our audience?
Yeah. It's like this is David Lynch, but it's also a nod to
Hitchcock.
Hitchcock. It is his visually most beautiful film, which kind of makes sense. Not because he doesn't care about the visuals. I feel like just David Lynch was like, I already made a beautiful film. Fuck this.
Well, I think it was his other films are beautiful, but in different ways.
Yeah.
This one feels like if David Lynch made a movie in the 1950s,
Yes.
but it has contemporary sensibilities.
Yeah, and the darkness is there for a reason. It's not as horrendous as make people make it out to be. It's just it's uncomfortable, which is what Lynch does best.
Yeah. I would recommend it highly. I think it is a perfect movie. Like watching it last night, I could not see a flaw in it. It kept me engaged the whole time. Every performance was wonderful. Outside of these movies, is there an additional David Lynch movie you would recommend to our audience?
Mulholland Drive.
And why would you recommend that one?
Because there's gay sex in it. No, I think it's another. It shows you the differences in how he has directed his actors. From this one being like more
Blue
between
Velvet.
like Blue Velvet, most of it is pretty realistic versus when you get to Frank. And then Mulholland Drive is more like
Noir.
noir, hyper, hyper driven, like the way that people are acting, or just like
There's like a
there's a manic nature about
yeah,
it.
to some well, it's very. I mean, a lot of his films are this way, but it does feel like dreamlike, especially
Yeah.
the diner scene, which feels so disconnected from everything else in the movie.
Yeah, and then but it's just there's this quality about it that just it's just Lynch embraces the darkness as much as he embraces the light.
If I was going to recommend another movie out of Lynch's catalog, I would recommend The Straight Story because a lot of people have a perception of who David Lynch is, and I think watching The Straight Story, a G-rated movie,
Yeah.
will completely reconfigure how you perceive this man. He is not uh he is filming in a location you've never seen him film in before, a kind of story you've never seen before. Sissy Spacek,
Yeah.
who was a longtime friend of his, is in the movie and is wonderful in it. But yeah, I think The Straight Story, and it's a movie that is all light. There is
Yeah.
no darkness in it.
Yeah, and it's a movie he wanted to make.
Yeah. So that is our episode.
All right.
Well, that was the Pop Cult Podcast for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure to check out our show notes for any links that are important to us, including to our website, popcult.blog. Make sure that you are subscribed to be notified when new episodes are up. If you visit popcult.blog, you'll find a lot more reviews. For February, our film series is going to be some Shakespeare on film. We're not going to watch every Shakespeare movie, not even all the best ones. We just kind of picked a handful of them. Our first week will feature reviews from Joseph L. Mankiewicz's Julius Caesar, Akira Kurosawa's take on Macbeth, Throne of Blood, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in The Taming of the Shrew. If you enjoy what we do here on the podcast and over on popcult.blog, we'd encourage you to support us on our Patreon. The link is in the show notes. There are lots of reward levels for you to pick from. And if you donate at the $10 or higher level a month, you get to pick a movie that I will watch every month, or one movie a month, and I'll review it. You can even include your thoughts in that review if you want as well. I want to thank our current patron at that level, Matt. He's at the writer's room level, and he had me write up a review for Carry On, which was an interesting film to watch, emphasis on it not being interesting. And he has a pretty good take for February that you'll learn more about when that review shows up on the blog. We also have patron-exclusive podcasts. As we said before in this episode, we're currently watching and recording episodes for our Ryusuke Hamaguchi Spotlight. We did a romantic comedy series. We've done some tabletop actual plays with the two of us. We've got plans for several more different miniseries to come. Next week on the Pop Cult Podcast, we are back to talking about some recent releases. We'll be talking about the Indian drama All We Imagine as Light and Nicole Kidman in Baby Girl. Well, until next time, you keep listening, we'll keep watching. Our podcast music was provided by thepodcasthost.com and Alitu, the podcast maker. Find your own free podcast music over at thepodcasthost.com/free music.